Would it have been possible for a Roman citizen around 1 AD to obtain everything needed to make a cheeseburger, assuming they had the knowledge of how to make one? I was thinking about this today. Originally I was thinking about how much 30 pieces of silver would have been worth back in those days, but then I realized there's no way to do a direct comparison because of technological and economic changes. Then I started thinking about the Big Mac Index, which compares cost of living by the price of a Big Mac in various places. Given that cheeseburgers didn't exist, it's kind of ridiculous to think about. But that got me thinking, would a typical Roman citizen have been able to buy beef, some means of grinding it to make hamburger, a griddle of some sort, cheese, lettuce, pickles, mustard, onions, and a sesame seed bun? I have excluded special sauce and tomatoes because tomatoes weren't in Europe back then and mayonnaise wasn't invented yet. User Turtle Donuts answers, let's start with beef, since the patty is the easiest part here, and also the most important part of the burger. The Romans absolutely had beef. There are dozens of references to beef throughout Greek and Roman literature. In the Odyssey, Odysseus kills some sacred cattle, and cooks the meat. I'm sure that in a big city like Rome, it would be easy to come across some beef. Grinding beef by hand might be hard, but I'm sure our Macraman can pull it off, considering his need for a delicious burger. You can do that with a decent knife, but it'll be an absolute pain. Next, we need cheese. Pliny, in his Natural History, 11:96-97, talks about cheese. In chapter 97, he lists off a bunch of kinds of cheese, but what sounds good to me is his comment that goats also produce a cheese which has been of late held in the highest esteem, its flavor being heightened by smoking it. Smoked goat cheese would be nice on a burger, if a little off from traditional McDonald's. Our greens are next. Onion is also mentioned in Pliny's text. In Book 19, Chapter 32, Pliny talks about onions. He mentions a few varieties of onions. The onions of Crete are known for the sweetness of their flavor. Sweet onion is my preferred burger onion, so let's hope our Macraman can find that. However, he can certainly find some kind of onion. We're doing good. Now for lettuce. Once again, we're in luck. The Romans ate lots of lettuce, and once again, Pliny has us covered. Chapter 38 of the same book is all about lettuce. He describes a bunch of lettuces, including one so large it could be used for a small garden gate. The footnotes in the translation seem to indicate this might be sessile, or romaine lettuce, so we'll go with that. However, any lettuce will do here, so let's not worry too much about that. We got lettuce. Pliny disappoints here with pickles. Despite devoting chapters 2 to 5 of Book 22, cucumbers as a medicine, and chapter 23 of Book 19 to cucumbers as something to grow in your garden, Pliny doesn't actually mention that you can pickle cucumbers anywhere I saw. Callium Rustica, on agriculture, however, does. He states that you mix up hard brine, which is heavily saturated salt water, and vinegar, which was made from wine and spices, and then you add cucumbers and all kinds of other stuff. Your pickles will be giving your burger a real funky taste. Mustard seed is also mentioned in Pliny. Apicus mentions mustard as well, and wants everyone to use it all the time. I didn't feel like crawling through more translations for all this, so I just went out and found someone else's adaptation of Apicus's mustard recipe. I linked it down below. The recipe is going to make a stone-ground, strong-flavored mustard. It's got some whole seeds, and is probably closest to modern brown mustard. This is strong artisanal stuff, so again with a funky taste and strong burger. Bread is going to be expensive at the least. Modern flour is of great quality, historically speaking. Only the finest flour would have been fine and white. Off in Book 18, Chapter 26, Pliny talks about bread and risen bread. He says that at the present day, however, the leaven is prepared from the meal that is used for making the bread. For this purpose, some of the meal is kneaded before adding the salt, and is then boiled to the consistency of porridge, and left till it begins to turn sour. That's sourdough. They have a starter culture, and then they would use it. It's not fed and kept like a modern sourdough culture, but it is decent starter yeast. The flavor from it will be inconsistent, and you'll probably have some grit from the grinding, but if your Macraman chills out all the cash he can, he'll get decent sourdough bread. This will not be a neutral flavored bun, and it's not going to look great. But you could buy some sort of small loaf at a bakery, so at least we have a bun. Sesame seeds are also not the hardest. It's an old crop, and a quick search pulled up a Jaster result on how the seed was well known to ancient Greek and Roman authors. I'm sure a Ronald Macraman can walk on down to the market and buy a little thing of sesame seeds if needed. So he just needs to pay the baker to put a bunch of sesame seeds on the nicest small loaf he has before he bakes it. Easy peasy. The Romans would have had frying pans and griddles, The Royal Ontario Museum of Archaeology has an article they published in the American Journal of Archaeology, which I found reproduced on the University of Chicago's website. It includes a number of illustrations of frying pans and griddles. They look not bad for frying. In summary, yes, we're going to Burger Town. But it's going to be gourmet, and not what we're used to. The biggest issue will be the beef, which is going to be a pain to butcher into ground beef. But it won't be that off from what you might get in a fancy hipster restaurant. I don't know how much this might all cost, sorry. User Celebrith answers, oh snap, I'm late to the party on this one. Let's talk about some McKeezers, shall we? First, let's discuss the basic components of a cheeseburger and what those entail. Some of the modern stuff, like heavily sugared buns, will obviously pass over. But we will be talking about what our ancient cheeseburger will taste like, and how it'd probably be pretty damn delicious, but with a bit of Roman flair. So most basic of the basic ingredients: buns, cheese, beef patty, possibly two if you're like me and eat more than your body weight in a day. I mean what? Salt and pepper. However, if you just make a burger with those things, it's going to be a boring burger. What makes the burger delicious isn't just its beef and cheese, but its toppings. Today, those include ketchup, mustard, mayo, and, oftentimes, some sort of mystery sauce. The Romans didn't have access to tomatoes, so we'll go ahead and skip that one. But not only can we get everything else, I think we can replace the ketchup and still have things taste just fine. Some other toppings and stuff are tomato, again, lettuce, onion, butter, and garlic powder, used for seasoning. But we don't want any old McDonald's burger, we want a real burger. So can we make Gordon Ramsay happy with readily available ingredients in Rome? I'm gonna go ahead and say absolutely. First off, I'm gonna go ahead and start with a quote from Cato the Elder who, among being a cantankerous old coot who liked hating on Carthage, wrote an entire book about how great cabbage is, as well as giving us this delightful quote. Of this last kind of comparisons is that quoted from the elder Cato, who, when asked what was the most profitable thing to be done on an estate, replied, to feed cattle well. What second best? To feed cattle moderately well. What third best? To feed cattle, though but poorly. What fourth best? To plow the land. And when he who had made these inquiries asked, what is to be said of making profit by usury? Cato replied, what is to be said of making profit by murder? Cicero, De Officiis, that is to say, the Romans loved beef and recognized the amount of money that could be made in the proper care and raising of cattle. While grain is what everyone talks about being mass-produced for the Roman people, it was a poor man's food, as shown by the constant grain subsidies that were in place to feed the people of Rome, not to mention the actually massive shipments coming in from across the Mediterranean. But the beef was not only high quality. I'll refer you to the non-cabbage related portions of Cato, written in the 2nd c. BCE, but it was certainly not a rare commodity. That being said, I'm not sure that the beef was particularly cheap. It's tough to nail down prices, and I'll see if I can do some side research into estimates for you. But since we don't even know for sure how much wheat cost, I'm digressing, but meat was meat, and the majority of Romans, the poor, did not have enough loose change to commit to it. That being said, other, more contemporary, authors talk about cows non-stop, and if you'd like to know more about cattle breeds, what they might have looked like, and what they were good for, I'd be happy to provide sources. For now, know that there were many, some were renowned for their meat, and some for their cheese. And oh my, did the Romans love their cheeses. Cows are versatile creatures, and they offer a variety of substances that were useful for this endeavor: meat, cheese, and butter. Now, the Romans weren't themselves heavy users of butter. Apicius avoids it in all of his recipes, and the Romans themselves seem to have seen it as a weird German thing, preferring olive oil or other fats, but it was certainly theoretically available. If you can make a good cheese, you can make butter. So we can certainly check off the butter, the cheese, probably way better cheese than you'd get with most burgers, honestly, and the beef quite easily. Salt is one of those things that everyone likes to misunderstand. There's a trope that the word salary came from the Roman soldiers being paid in salt, which has no real basis, but hey, the Romans themselves were unsure about where their word salarium came from. Either way, the Romans had salt, and they greedily held control over their salt supplies. One of those mines was at one of Rome's major ports in Ostia, giving easy access to the resource. Pepper, on the other hand, is not a naturally occurring European resource. However, by 1 CE, thanks for that date, gives me the excuse to rant about Roman trade networks. Trade with India was booming. After the subjugation of Egypt in 31 BCE, The Romans subsumed the Ptolemaic trade routes through the province, driving the previous levels of trade to a fever pitch, a trade explosion which continued for over 200 years. Where trade had previously been slow, with as few as 20 ships making the trip, the Romans used their military as a workforce to create the necessary infrastructure for intensifying trade with the East. Over 100 ships were soon making the annual journey to India. One where enterprising merchants had previously only been able to travel at night, heavily stocked with water and in constant fear of banditry, the Romans built and fortified roads, water stations, and the trading cities themselves. Shipyards were built in an attempt to support the failed invasion of Arabia in 26 CE, which were easily converted to civilian use afterwards. This large-scale rise in infrastructure created a fertile environment for a wave of consumerism to sweep the Roman world, with demand for Eastern luxuries and spices increasing dramatically among those with disposable income. Those imports ranged from places as far apart as Madagascar and Vietnam. The primary partner of Rome in this sea trade, however, was India. Trade ports ranged across the subcontinent, each one offering a different selection of trade goods, the most common of which was pepper. 3 other imports included varied types of luxury wood, precious stones, frankincense and myrrh, and textiles such as cotton and silk. Indian imports quickly became central to Roman life, with recipes and medicines commonly using exotic spices, such as malabotrum or the especially unhelpfully described Ispicum indicum. I've provided a few sources at the bottom for further reading on this, since there's honestly a vast wealth of information discussing Roman trade and how quickly and deeply it was tied to Rome. It quickly became the big business in the Roman Empire, with individual shiploads being valued in the millions of sestertii. McLaughlin's book is an excellent one, and Lytle is a magnificent researcher when it comes to Near Eastern trade and ancient fishermen. But I digress. By this time, pepper would have been readily available in multiple types, and wouldn't be too terrifically difficult to come by. Garlic, too, is a native herb to Europe, Asia, and beyond, and would not have been rare or even worth special commentary for its difficulty to find. Fear not, your beef patty will be perfectly seasoned, assuming that you're a decent chef and or have access to YouTube so that you can do a quick search on Gordon Ramsay's burger. The onion, too, was incredibly popular in all sorts of things, from cooking to medicine, and your request to put onions on this concoction would have been met with approval from whomever you were commissioning. That and the fact that it wasn't hard to come by, so it would have been reasonably cheap. Overall, by the way, this burger probably would cost you a pretty penny. Probably not those 30 pieces of silver, but certainly something that you would see at an Epicurean feast.